The film opens with a scene that appears to be a grand celebration. Diane stands up and acknowledges the challenges they faced after Nick's father's death. She then praises Nick, stating that raising him has been rewarding and that she believes they will both achieve great things in the future. Diane raises a glass to her son, Nick, and presents him with an engraved gift. "Make me proud, Nick," she says. Nick then heads to the food table, cuts a piece from the center of a chocolate cake, and carries it in his hands to the garage. He sits down near a workbench, and suddenly brings a shotgun to his face. However, it turns out to be a dream, as Nick wakes up alarmed in the morning. After breakfast, Nick rides his bike to school. At school, Nick hands a French essay to his classmate, Pete Egan. A girl then approaches Nick, inviting him to a party that night, but he declines, saying he is busy with other tasks. Later, Pete is confronted in the restroom by a group of teenagers led by Annie, who accuses him of taking things without payment. The group threatens Pete with a knife, and Annie warns that she will cut off his finger if he doesn't pay up soon. They then leave the restroom. In a subsequent scene, a student reads his poem to the class. Afterward, the teacher asks Nick to recite his poem. As he speaks, the entire class becomes captivated by his words, but the school bell interrupts him. Nick confronts Annie's group and pays for the items his friend took. He questions Annie about the owed amount and keeps adding money to the table, asking if it's sufficient. Annie tells him to go away. As he leaves, Nick leans in and whispers, "She is so broken." Annie, infuriated, attacks Nick in the cafeteria. Both are escorted to the principal's office. When asked what happened, Nick jokingly says that Annie finds him attractive. The principal sends Annie home and advises Nick to steer clear of people like her. Annie returns to her apartment, where she chastises her mother for not feeding her younger brother, Victor. She demands that her mother get up from the couch, while her father watches. Annie's mother pleads with her father to intervene, but he sides with Annie, leading to a heated argument between the parents. Annie retreats to her room and listens to music on her headphones after ensuring Victor has been fed. That night, Nick meets Pete, who gives him some money and asks about translations his mother requested. Pete then inquires if Nick is attending Ava's party, but Nick says he won't be there. Nick hands Pete a book with a hidden airline ticket to London, where Nick plans to join the writing program. Nick explains that since his father's death. At the same time, Annie's boyfriend, Marcus Bohem, joins her in stealing a car. As they approach a store displaying jewelry, Annie smashes the window and grabs a beautiful necklace. They escape in the stolen car, evading the police. The following morning, Annie and Marcus argue, and she leaves. Marcus wants her to leave the stolen jewelry behind, but she doesn't trust him. Angered by this, Marcus tips off the authorities about her thefts at school. At school, Pete keeps an eye on Annie at her locker. When the police arrive, they break into her locker and find the stolen jewelry. Annie calls Marcus, informing him of her arrest. He feigns innocence, while she vows to handle the situation. Nick and Pete ride their bikes home, discussing Nick's upcoming journey. Pete expresses his desire to join Nick in London and pursue a cricket career there. Nick playfully reminds Pete that he lacks both a passport and the funds for a ticket. They then say their goodbyes. Upon arriving home, Nick learns from his mother that his flight has been rescheduled. Nick tries to explain, but his mother expresses disappointment, feeling like she's living with a stranger. Later that night, Pete is ambushed by Annie and her gang. Under pressure, he directs them to Nick, who is at the much-discussed school party. At the party, Nick meets a girl and proposes that they fly to London together in 2 hours. As they kiss, she finds a new watch in his pocket and questions why he's wearing an old one. He explains that it was a gift from his father. Nick leaves the party for a walk and is followed by an old car carrying Annie and her crew. They assault Nick as Pete watches from the car. Despite Pete's pleas, they continue their attack. Annie taunts Nick, asking, "Who is the broken one now?" To which Nick replies, "You are." This enrages Annie, who kicks him into a lake. They check for signs of life and, finding none, panic. Annie regains her composure and orders her gang to retrieve Nick. They carry him into the woods, inadvertently dropping his watch, and dump his body in a storm drain before covering it and leaving. Annie goes to Marcus's house, confessing that she killed Nick and needs an alibi. He refuses, citing his probation. She notes the stolen cars in his garage, smearing her bleeding hand on them before leaving to burn her clothes by the river. The next day, Nick emerges from the bushes and onto a road, seemingly unharmed. He discovers that he's invisible and inaudible to everyone around him. He tries causing a scene in his school but is unsuccessful. In the principal's office, Nick overhears his mother on the phone but is unable to communicate with her. He leaves the school, gets hit by a car and a truck, but remains unscathed and unnoticed. The police are investigating his disappearance. Nick wanders through the town, unseen by passers-by, and tries to tell his mother he's dead. Detectives Kate Tunney and Brian Larson encounter Annie. The detectives find tire tracks near the woods and a broken car part on the ground. They learn of the conflict between Annie and Nick and visit Annie's home to question her. They find her on the roof, and she denies knowing Nick's whereabouts but is told to contact them if she learns anything. A search party forms to look for Nick in the woods. Nick's mother reads his poetry journal in his room, as an injured bird perches on the porch railing. The bird is injured and about to perish. Nick notices a lively bird on his shoulder and grasps it in his hand. As the bird on the railing dies and the one in his hand vanishes, Nick realizes he must still be alive. He tries to guide the search party by influencing the search dogs and pleading with Annie for help, but she can't hear him. Detective Larson visits Marcus's garage, questioning him about the jewelry store robbery. Marcus claims he wasn't involved, but Larson knows Annie called him. Larson then asks about the missing person case. Marcus, at gunpoint, stops Pete outside, telling him the police are after them. They return to the woods where Nick was last seen. Marcus gathers Annie's gang, informing her that she'll be summoned to confess. Annie calls Pete and asks him to join her group. Marcus arrives with Annie, holding her at gunpoint, and tells Pete to go home. Annie puts the gun to her stomach and dares Marcus to shoot her. A goon yells, "Cop," and Annie grabs the gun, pointing it at the officers and fleeing as they order her to stop. Annie reaches Nick's home after spending the night in a school gym. She explores his room and examines his possessions. As Nick's mother enters, Annie scatters ashes from a small container onto her hand. She rushes to the woods to the spot where Nick was last seen but finds him gone. Finding a pack of nicotine gum, Annie locates Pete's new hideout. Pete admits that neither he nor Nick turned Annie in. She confronts Marcus, dragging him to a ledge with a gun to his head. After Annie and Marcus shoot each other, Annie calls Detective Larson, claiming to know Nick's location. Pete attempts suicide, and Nick finds Pete's spirit beside him as he dies. Pete's father arrives just in time to save him. Nick is taken to the hospital after being rescued from the river. Despite her gunshot wound, Annie tries to reach him. Nick guides her through the hospital, and through Annie, he communicates with his mother. As Nick's spirit re-enters his body, Annie talks to him in the hospital room and lies down beside him. She loses consciousness at that moment. By a lake, a young boy flies a remote-controlled plane. Nick watches the child, concerned for his safety. The boy mentions he was supposed to bring his sister, but she passed away. Nick suggests sending her a message. They write, "Hey Annie," on the plane's wings and set it free to soar.